Hey guys, this is DFD, aka Dark Frozen Depths, back with another Kamihime project video. This is the second of the 6 different malicious raid guide videos, and I have to point out the obvious right now. It says PB03 when we already got PB01. They're releasing it in order of elemental weaknesses. So we had the fire one first. Fire is strong against wind. Wind will be strong against thunder, which is the next. Thunder will be strong against water, which is the next. That's how it's getting released. So it's not in numerical order. It's by element order, more or less, like by what's strong against what. So I gotta point out the obvious with that. That's why we got wind before, say, water, which I do believe is the second one. But anyways, this is the wind malicious. This one's actually kind of dangerous if you're not careful about it. So this one is a big step up from the previous one. The previous one is manageable. This one still is manageable even with low HP too, but you really have to get crafty if you want to try and take it on, regardless how strong you are. So anyways, this is supposed to be a guide for that one. Some general stuff with all the malicious raids still apply here too. Like, for instance, you only get 1 elixir. If you use that elixir and then die again, or if you just use the elixir without dying, you're just screwed if your team gets wiped out. There's no coming back off of that, so just hope somebody else kills the fight for you. And given some of the damage that this one can do to you, it is very likely that you can die, even with 40 or even 50,000 HP, if you screw up. So, that said, be very, very careful with this fight, because if you have any intention of trying to survive throughout the entire fight, you need to make sure that you're with a group of players that can easily break it down, or you simply just gotta protect yourself extraordinarily well, or both. But getting into it, first and foremost, all the malicious raids tend to have this same stuff where the defense value is 10, so that's normal defense in the game, don't worry about that. They all tend to have 850 million HP. So all these Phantom Beast Malicious raids, they will have 850 million. I say Phantom Beast because there's going to be another malicious raid later down the line. The Wind one specifically has 5 orbs for it before it does its enemy burst. So it may seem like a lot, but it's not how the fight actually plays out. I'll get to more details about that later on. There is a raging gauge, of course. All the malicious raids tend to have it, so that's something to know. The other thing that you have to be very careful about, if you do decide to fight this without fire, you deal half HP, like half damage. You have half damage if you use anything other than fire against the wind one. You need elemental advantage if you want to not have your damage penalized. Not to mention, you're going to just take more damage if you're not using fire anyway, so be careful with that. Your damage cut is also half effective. What that means is, say you're using Romulus and she has that 60% damage cut for pretty much everybody in a raid, it's 30% in these fights. So be careful of that. It still helps, it's just not going to be as strong. If you want to have the best damage protection, you need stuff like debuffs, elemental resistance, even barrier can help you out depending on how strong it is and how much damage you're taking per hit. Some characters will get something called damage minus. There's a couple of them that's actually in the game already. Those are very helpful for reducing the damage you take too, depending on who you have and what team they're on. So that's something to know. Damage cut is just not going to be as effective. It helps, but it's not as effective. Now, the last thing I need to mention too is the fact that all the malicious raids have this little system that's based on turn count. So here's a quick little explanation of that. They will switch between no gear, blue gear, red gear, then go back to no gear. So no gear is the first 5 turns of the cycle. Do not burst during this point. Like, at all, do not burst. If you burst any point during the no gear phase, every one of these Phantom Beast Malicious raids will counter you in some shape or form. The counter for this one will be that the enemy will put its orbs to full. If its orbs is already full, it will use its burst and then go back to full orbs, so there's no cheesing it. So that said, do not burst, because if you burst, the enemy's going to break out its own a lot quicker, and it hits hard. It's pretty dangerous, in fact. Now for blue gear, every malicious raid has the first condition, which is dealing 50 million damage on your own within the 5 turns of blue gear. What that means is you have 5 turns to rack up 50 million damage however you can. There's also a second condition for each malicious raid too, but that's dependent on the raid. What this one is, it has a specific type of buff on itself where it will like up its orb count. So you generally have to erase that buff. So you need three stacks of buff erasing if you want to try and get rid of that. I have a few like characters that come to mind that can probably do that, but I generally wouldn't worry about that condition if you cannot meet the 50 million damage condition, because you have to meet both conditions for blue gear. Reason being is that when it comes to red gear, first off, the transition between blue gear and red gear is going to deal damage, so be careful with that one. You need to have some protection for that most likely. But also, if you met the conditions for blue gear, meaning the 50 million damage and the second condition, you deal more damage to the enemy. It's I do believe a 25% damage increase, or somewhere around that mark. If you don't meet those conditions, you deal 20% less damage, if I'm correct. But the general thing is, you fail the conditions, you deal less damage. You meet the conditions, you deal more. So you get a damage bonus if you meet those conditions, but it's hard to meet those conditions to begin with. The other thing about red gear is the fact that the bosses tend to get a little bit harder to deal with, and they also hit harder. So red gear is going to up their damage regardless of what happens. So that's easily the most dangerous part of the fight, especially when they get like half HP where they're already boosted even more on top of that. So red gear is definitely going to be the case where you probably need to play on the defensive a little bit, unless you've met the blue gear conditions, in which case that's your best chance at dealing damage. So that said, depending on what happens with blue gear can determine how you handle red gear. Or you just can't handle the damage increase anyway. You're going to be defensive on red gear. So 5 turns of no gear, 5 turns of blue gear, 5 turns of red gear, then it flips back around to no gear. So that's a 15 turn cycle. Pay attention to your turn count. Anybody that's doing auto battle just needs to have their burst turns off to be safe, because you're going to end up bursting at the wrong time if you leave it on. It always happens. So turn off your burst if you're going into auto battle. Now, I also mentioned the thing about half HP. The deal with that, there's a specific thing that happens to each fight at half HP, like they might start landing more debuffs or stuff like that. But the one thing that's common between all the Phantom Beast Malicious raids is that when it's at half HP, they gain 25% more attack and defense that cannot be removed. If you're using debuffs, that means you need another 25% to offset it, because that's how buffs and debuffs work. They offset each other. So if you have 75% in attack and defense down, doesn't matter if it's the normal attack defense down or if it's elemental like resistances and all that. If you have 25% in that you can land on the boss, like another 25%, you will still maintain that 50% total. So you need 75% to stay at max efficiency. So that's something to know. Also, I did get it a little bit wrong earlier. It's 10% damage reduction if you don't meet the conditions. So it's not that penalizing, to be quite honest, but it's still something to be wary about. So you don't meet blue gear conditions, you lose 10% of your damage. But it does add up if you're off element. So my recommendation, use elemental advantage unless you absolutely have no choice. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting, because they give some numbers for some of these. I tend to ignore that because of the fact that you can generalize a number of damage you take, but it's still not exact. But it's something. But they do give multipliers, which actually helps gauge what happens. So in normal mode, of course, if anybody does a burst, like if anybody has a burst going off no gear, everybody on the team takes a 2 times multiplier, and its orbs goes to full. Well, it says max -1, but it's still basically full because it'll increase to full right after that. So be careful with that. You're going to get nuked pretty hard, and the next turn you're just seeing an enemy burst hitting you. If you use red abilities, everybody gets a 1 times multiplier and nothing else. This is the least amount of damage on a single character, but it's more damage overall. If you don't do anything else to meet those conditions, then you'll just see one character get hit with a 2 times multiplier. Dealing with no gear is pretty much the easiest point of the fight. Simply just attack it normally, build up your burst gauges for when you do go into blue gear, and you could use red abilities if you want. It all depends on if you want somebody to take more damage or not. But generally, you're just trying to prepare for the blue gear and the red gear phase, if you ask me. Speaking of which, again, after the 5 turns of no gear, you'll go into blue gear. Now, the kicker is that when it's in blue gear, you will need to do the 50 million damage, and for this fight specifically, remove 3 of its buffs. So you have to do that on your own. You get no assistance from anybody else for that one. You have to do it on your own because it's player-sided. Be careful when it switches from blue to red gear, though. On the 5th turn of blue gear, it's going to nuke everybody on the team. And it's going to be a 5 times multiplier. It is the biggest AoE multiplier it's going to have. So you may want some protection against that one. Now, when it's in red gear, this is where the fight gets dangerous because, of course, whether or not the conditions are met, it's going to deal more damage. However, it's also going to increase the orbs it gains per turn. So, anytime it has a turn in red gear, it is saying that it's going to put its orbs to max -1. But since you're immediately gaining another one, this is going to go back to max. You need to make sure that you have at least a good amount of protection in this phase because of the fact that you're going to see its bursts go off a lot more. So you will get nuked pretty hard in this one. But at the same time too, if you do have the conditions met for blue gear, this is a perfect time to unload since you have bonus damage. So that's something to know. And if it's stunned, anytime it's stunned, it's just going to do a normal attack. Doesn't matter what phase it's in or whatever. So keep that in mind. Now then, when it's 50% or less HP, it's going to have an increased damage amount on its burst. So be very careful with that one. But the burst itself is 10 random hits, all 3 times multiplier. And if its HP is half, it'll also hurt itself. But it's still going to increase the damage it deals with its burst. So be careful with that. This is the most damaging part of the fight. This is what you need to focus your teams around, because the damage it can get is pretty insane. Now, the summary of the damage right here says it can be 10 hits of 18,000. That's only if you're meeting the 50% attack down and have no protection, and you're using fire. But it can still get increased off of the half HP stuff. And then even worse is the fact that if you are, like, say, no protections or whatever, and then you're suddenly, like, getting nuked pretty hard, you can see the damage go upwards to hundreds of thousands per hit. So it is the most damaging thing in the fight. Damage cut is basically required. Like, not specifically damage cut, but anything that drastically reduces the damage you take. Elemental resistance is very good. Damage cut to go with the elemental resistance does indeed stack. If anybody's got the ability to just pretty much ignore damage, this is the time to break that out. This is the most dangerous part of the fight, that burst. And it goes off very often. If it's at half HP or less, it will gain an extra orb every time it attacks, so it's going to be extremely frequent. Like half HP or less, it will remove one max orb off its turn count, and then it also will like gain another orb every time it hits. So it's very dangerous for that. If you're going to do this fight, you have to either assume you're going to die by the first set of turn cycles, meaning like 15 turns or less, or you need to have some serious protection against this burst. This is the bane of the fight. It is, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, cancer level damage. It is ridiculous how much damage you can take from this. If you want to have a very good chance of surviving this, you need strong protection, and most likely at least 30,000 HP. If you truly want to be safe from it, then get like 40 or 50,000 HP and get at least one elemental resistance, like a 40% one or something like that. But it still can be bad RNG and just pile up on one character and kill them outright. So, again, protect yourself with this one. You will need some sort of damage reduction. You will need some sort of damage reduction. There's no avoiding it. Now, how do you deal with that type of stuff? First off, the 2 souls that they recommend right here, I fully agree with this one depending on your strategy. If you're going more defensive, take Romulus. If you're going a bit more offensive, you want Perseus. The reason I say that is because Perseus can have orb removal in 2 forms. One of them directly does it is an EX skill. Another thing in Perseus's kit is a debuff where you will actually prevent the enemy from gaining an orb during that turn. So it still delays them. You want both of those on Perseus if you're going that route. And Perseus also helps with your offense by debuffing the enemy's attack and defense. So, that said, Perseus is pretty good for an offensive build. You can still go offensive with Romulus, but Perseus is better at it. You can take Romulus if you're going defensive because of the fact that cover characters can be very helpful for this. That burst is multi-hit, but if you're doing cover, it all focuses on one character. So if you can get that one character to survive, you're very good to go. Romulus has access to an EX skill that makes one person immune to damage for that turn. So it greatly helps out with that if you use a cover character and then put that buff on them. And Romulus also has a buff eraser, like a buff eraser too. You can have access to that if you want, or you can have access to an orb eraser, or both. But if you take access to that buff eraser, then that means that you're not going to have that one buff that ignores damage. But Romulus has a few setups for that one. The fact that she can remove an orb, and the fact that she can do a cover, a pretty strong one at that. And the fact that she can put that damage ignore buff on somebody. That's very good for that one. Now, for permanent characters in the gacha, Prometheus, they suggest because of the orb eraser. She does have a wind resistance as well. But she's only good if you're doing the Perseus strategy, in my opinion. So, if you're going the Perseus route, take Prometheus with you as well. Mars, it's the only buff eraser for fire that's permanent among the SSR characters. She can remove 2 of them, in fact. If you have somebody else that can do it in the raid, well, not in the raid, but have somebody else that can do it on your team, like Romulus with her EX skill, or Perseus with her EX skill, then you're good to go for the conditions. But my personal opinion, the only reason you would probably take Mars other than meeting the blue gear conditions is just to have some elemental resistance down. So that's something to keep in mind. Mars is if you plan on going for the offense, and the only time you really need to plan on going for the offense is if you can meet the blue gear conditions. If you can do the 50 million damage in 5 turns, take Mars. That's my suggestion. Dion said, I don't need to say anything about her. She gives you barriers, she gives you wind resistance, she gives a vigor buff, she gives healing, she gives potions. She's just made for this fight. Just take her. If you don't have her, I suggest you try to get her. Nurgle has a cover and an invincibility that she can put on herself. So it really helps out with that one. And it also helps that she has a method of increasing her vigor as well. Now, that's if you want to go a little bit more defensive, but it's still very helpful all the same. Another character that they don't have on this list for some reason that I don't understand why is Daki. Daki is a very powerful permanent Kamihime for this fight. 2 reasons why. 1, that wind resistance she gives is a 2-turn 40% wind resistance. And since damage cut is what gets half effective, that means her damage reduction is actually stronger than Romulus. And it gets even stronger if Daki's awakened because it then becomes a 50%. Now, the other thing too is that Daki has a drain, which is a pretty good drain. It can give you extra healing on top of what Dion Set does. So, Daki is very good for that one. If you want to go on the offensive front, she also ups your normal attack damage. And your combo rate. Which in turn also helps your drain. So, Daki is extraordinarily good for this fight. I would say she's a necessity for this fight if you want to be honest. Like, Dion and Daki should not be removed off of here. Another one that may or may not help you is also the fire version of Amon. The SSR fire version. But the SR fire version probably could help you out too, depending on the situation. It just depends on who you have. But, the SSR version of Amon for fire, she buffs. She can do a decent damage nuke, but it's not necessarily needed. She gives you some damage protection as well. So, that helps out. And she's helping filling up your burst gauge too. So, that version of Amon is also pretty good. I don't know why she's not on this list either, but there you go. Now then, limited characters. Some of these are not in the game at the time of this video, just like how Daki can awaken. But Soul, she's like the onset. Covers a lot of different things where she gives you some protection, she gives you healing. She can also do some debuffing as well. So there you go for that. Cybele is not in the game right now, but she is a very, very powerful character. Her normal attack damage is insane, but the biggest gimmick for this fight, she gives an AoE invincibility. It's got a cooldown that is very long, but it's instantly going to say screw an enemy burst, because everybody's just not going to take damage for that one turn. Another limited character that is extraordinarily great for this, and I suggest you get her if you really want to take this fight seriously, Fire Shamash. She is extraordinarily good at cover because of the fact that she can also have an auto revive. If you do things properly, she is unkillable. So keep that in mind. Then on top of that too, she also has that orb removal that Perseus has, where it prevents an enemy from getting an orb for that turn. Her, plus Perseus, plus Prometheus, all 3 of them, they are a very valid delay strat in order to make sure you don't take that many enemy bursts. If you are planning on going the orb removal route, Shamash is pretty much needed. If you're going the defensive route, Shamash greatly helps. She's just made for this fight. So I suggest getting her. The fire version of Tish. She does have some debuffing, but her main gimmick is to fully heal somebody. So, that said, it can come in handy with your cover characters. I don't necessarily say she's needed, but she does greatly help. So, keep that in mind. And then there's a fire version of Atum. She comes with some debuffing, and she comes with some frequent healing. That's already good. She can grant an auto revive too. But what makes her very good is when she gets a buff later on, where she can handle the damage down debuffing and then give patience buffs. Those two combined are very, very powerful, especially since damage down stacks with other stuff like attack down and all that. When Fire Atum gets her buff later on, like her rebalance, she's insanely strong for this fight. However, even without it, she still could be pretty good, depending on how you use her. So, I can't say she's a necessity now, but she can be later. But she is limited, just like the other I mentioned with this section right here. Soul, Cybele, Shamash, Tish, and Atum are all limited. You may not get them. They do come back, but you may not get them. But if you have any of them, my suggestion is to use them, because they all have some very good, like, effects for this fight. Now, the last thing I need to mention too is the fact that biggest thing that about this raid is that, of course, the enemy burst is the thing that really screws you over if you're not prepared for it. But because the reward you get is based on the damage you do, you really want to try and do as much damage as you possibly can regardless. Because of the simple fact that if you do not do enough damage, there's a very good chance you're not getting a purple chest. Which means you're probably not getting the drops that matter. So, again, prepare for this fight accordingly. Try to take it seriously, because you're only screwing yourself, if anything. Because I'm pretty sure others are more than likely going to be prepared for a fight and still handle it even without you. So, you'd just be a burden if you're really screwing yourself. Like, if you're really screwing up. And then on top of that too, you see in some of these examples that they show for different characters and all that type of stuff where they have like 40, 50,000 HP. That's very doable right about now, because of the fact that the Fire Malicious raid is already out. Even free players can really try to stack up that much HP if they want to. It depends on their strategies and whatnot, but generally speaking, you should prepare for this fight by already grinding the Fire Malicious raid. It is already out at the time of this video. Fire got released before Wind. And Fire is a lot easier than Wind if you ask me. So, that said, prepare by doing Fire before Wind. But I do have to also mention that me personally, I have indeed done this fight with less than 20,000 HP and survived the entire fight while doing a good 30 plus turns. It is possible. I don't recommend it, but it's possible. But my personal suggestion, use Fire Malicious to prepare for this fight. Especially since you'll get some very good stuff from Fire Malicious raid. There's a very good defender in there that can really spike up your HP. There's a very good Ascension weapon too that comes with Assault. And Ultimate Limit Breaks or Final Limit Break 2, however you call it, the 5-star weapons are very powerful. Even if they're free, they're very powerful. Then you can get accessories that can also spike up your stats and damage too. So that's something else that will really help you out for this fight. So again, prepare for the win one by doing the Fire one, in my opinion. But anyways, that's all for this. I'm showing this little part right here because there's also little other things they have on this as well. This isn't JP Wiki. This is something called Kami Labs. But they do show a malicious version of the Och raid, which is the Phantom Guardian. Yes, she's malicious, but she's not as strong as these other ones. But there is a Guardian Malicious. That's why I have to say Phantom Beast Malicious. So expect more videos of this stuff as these malicious raids come out, because they are the hardest content in the game, bar none. In my opinion, the Wind and the Light ones are the hardest fights in the game, period. So seriously prepare for these guys. I'm not kidding. Like, you need to be very prepared for this. You don't have to have stats beefed out the wazoo, but you do have to be prepared enough. If I can do it with less than 20,000 HP, that automatically proves that you don't need to be like top of the line gear. But at the same time, I still suggest you get as strong as you can. So that's something to know. But anyways, that's all for this. More of this will come soon. Again, there's still another 4 Phantom Beast Malicious. There's still an Och Malicious. I will do guides on those as they come out. They're basically coming out with the Phantom Beast ones like once a month at this rate, so like near the end of this month you'll probably see the next one come out, which is going to be Thunder. So expect a guide on that after it comes out. But anyways, that's all for this. I still have to upload a video of actually playing the Wind Malicious raid, so you can get a general idea of what I've done on it. But again, don't take my example as the best way to go about it, because I clearly do not have as much HP as I should. It's just the fact that it's still doable with that one. That's why I'm still showing it off. It's not necessarily about what you have, it's how you use it. But anyways, that's all for now, guys. More will come soon, and take care.